Thank you for staying here on the AM show. It's some 5 minutes after 8. And over the last 2 years, a groundbreaking consensus emerged, not just amongst academics and practitioners, but also among member states, that development and peace are not only inextricably linked, but utterly inseparable. The Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and Goal 16 in particular emphasize that development or lack thereof is both a driver of conflict and an impediment to peace. Now, that's why the UNDP presents the high-level policy dialogue event from today to tomorrow. Now, the experts at that roundtable event, due to be held in Accra, Ghana, from the 29th to the 30th of September, will bring together leading policymakers, practitioners, academics, and representatives from bilateral, multilateral, regional, and sub-regional organizations and civil society organizations. Ahead of that, Mamavio Uso Abuaji is speaking to Dr. Ozonia Ojielo. He's the Regional Cluster Director of Governance and Peace Building with the UNDP.
And quality of our governing arrangements, are they working for Africans? Take any country in Africa. Look at the number of young people that leave college or high school every year. And look at the number of those that have jobs. We are not meeting the expectations of our peoples. So there's a huge rise in expectation. Our capacity to deliver is significantly much smaller than those expectations. So you need to have a different kind of conversation. A conversation that looks at the degree of ambition of our rulers, of our governing elite, but also how those expectations can be met without having a friction in the society. The 2011 Arab Revolt should teach us a lesson about the potential where we don't have this kind of conversation. So this meeting is designed to challenge ourselves. It's Africa responding to the needs of its peoples. And if it is not, what needs to happen? And we recognize that governance is fundamental to the effectiveness of government. So what do you do differently to make this happen?
I guess when you talk about what do you do differently, then you also be looking at leadership, because that's been, if not the most challenging thing with Africa.
That is a very significant question. And in the context of Africa, there's a lot of discussion about whether leadership is responding to our needs. And you see, the interesting thing is that people make a comparison. They compare most of our leaders to the late Mandela, and they think that their leaders have fallen short. So we have placed Mandela on a pedestal that is actually impossible for anybody to meet. The truth is that Mandela was humane. He was a human person. Mandela had lots of faults. He had lots of weaknesses. But in spite of the faults and the weaknesses, he could step up in relation to what the needs of the average South African was in his time. Actually, if you look at his personal family life and his public life, there are two divergences. People thought he failed as a family man, but he was very successful in thinking about the rest of South Africa. I make this comparison because there's a Mandela in all of us.
So why doesn't it show? It doesn't seem to be showing. Look at all around us.
Absolutely, that is the challenge. Because if you make Mandela an avatar, somebody beyond human, why do I have to aspire to be like him? I would say, well, he's an avatar, and since I can't meet him, let me stay in my small mindedness. So we want to challenge our leaders to see the Mandelas in themselves, to step up beyond their own immediate environment, their immediate comforts, to go beyond all the views that research has shown about the failures of leadership in Africa, and to be far-sighted into the future in terms of the needs of their own people, and to begin to respond to those needs. And we hope that all the 54 countries in Africa don't have to do that at the same time. The continent is yearning for champions. The continent is yearning for path blazers. And if some can step up in that expectation, it can cascade down to the rest of the continent.
Is leadership the only thing holding us back?
I wish. Because if it were, you might say that with the demonstration of leadership, with a new sense of purpose by some of our leaders, things will change. It's not the only thing. There are many things holding us back. You look at the issue of elections. Many are beginning to say that what we have is actually electoral democracy. Do our elections in most of the continent make our leaders feel accountable? Beyond the voting, do people feel that they're participating in their own governing arrangements? And because of that, there's a total disconnect between those who are in power and those they are leading. I know I'm making broad general statements, so I'm not particularizing on any countries, but I'm looking at the regional trends. So because people disconnect, what you see is that people don't feel that the leaders respond to them. And importantly, some are beginning to feel also that maybe because of their religion, because of the language they speak, because of the part of the country they come from, they are excluded from governance. And they are reacting in many ways. One of the most profound ways that people are reacting is violent extremism. So people are attacking others, people are destroying infrastructure. And we did a study recently, and you know what was fascinating? Majority of those who are violent extremists, they come from the border areas. And border areas in Africa have historically been excluded, historically marginalized. They are at the bottom of the bottom in terms of development and location. So people are angry. People are hurting. They're feeling like you don't want us. So let's destroy this commonwealth we have so nobody can benefit from it. So there are multiple problems in Africa. The key is to recognize that the world is transforming at a rapid pace. And if you are a leader, or if you are in leadership, you can't do it alone. If you don't have the majority of the people working with you and understanding with you, it's going to be very difficult.
You know, we've been talking about our challenges for a very long time. We've been talking about leadership, for instance. We've been talking about all the things that you're saying this morning. But perhaps, maybe we need a different style, either of leadership or governance. Is this kind of governance our own? Are we owning it, or we're just copying what is happening elsewhere? Maybe that's what's not working.
Mama, you have hit the nail on the head. And that's why we think that this subject has become really important. When we gained political independence, as most African countries, there was already a standard, a pattern that the colonialists left for us. So there's an assumed notion that that's the right way. So we began implementing, so whether it's Westminster style or the parliamentary democracy, the presidential democracy you had in France, or the new democracy you had from the United States, we began to assume that that's the way governance is hard. Now, the truth is that even in their own societies, it is failing them. So whether you see Brexit, whether you see the rise of the Tea Party in the United States, whether you see the declining participation in governing by young people across board in Europe or North America, the rise of the new right in Europe, basically underpinning the essential foundations of liberal democracy that we've known it in Europe and North America, they are signposts that people are unhappy with the nature of the own governing arrangement.
So we're not alone then?
No, we're not alone. Now, the difference is that we have to start questioning ourselves. We have to start questioning these assumed notions and ways of doing things. So we're asking ourselves, is there an African way of governance that can respond to our needs? And we're not talking about African exceptionalism. We're not saying, oh, we're so special and so different that everything African is the way to go. No, we are saying in the 21st century, with the imported notions of governance we've had, not responding to the degree of ambition that Africans want, what needs to shift? What needs to change? So it's important to have that conversation. But have that conversation in ways that are meaningful. There's not just an academic discussion, but grounded in the realities of the continent, but then finding champions that can lead that discussion. This discussion is not new. You find that 30, 40 years ago, in the context of East-West Cold War, we assumed that either you took the socialist route or you took the capitalist route. Now, we are saying we don't believe in extremes. It's not about capitalism or socialism. There is something inherent about our way of organizing our society. And you see the dichotomies when you go to our communities, when you see how we socially organize ourselves and mobilize our resources, our capacities for change to happen in our communities. When your community needs to do something and government is not present, we have ways of mobilizing. Why can't those ways of mobilizing inform larger systems of political and social organization in Africa? Why do you have this duality? There's a duality of life in the traditional, but a duality in the modern. But the modern is not responding, the traditional is local. So where is the median between the traditional and the modern that responds to the needs of Africa? We are asking those questions. Africans want more. Africans are asking the governments to step up. And our role is to alert everyone it's time for a new beginning. Let's press the reset button in Africa. Let's do things differently. And we do hope that there will be champion governments that will take this conversation forward.
So who are we having this conversation with? Who are we thinking and raising the issues and hoping, because I think the most important is for all these talks to reflect when they go back to their various countries.
And that was the most fascinating part. Because we've been saying to ourselves, how do we know that this subject will resonate across the continent? And the first invitations we sent, within 24 hours, more than 50% had confirmed. So we are bringing the best and the brightest of Africans from around the world. Let's interrogate ourselves. We have governments, we have former presidents who are coming, we have parliamentarians, we have civil society activists. Now the question is, why are we doing this in Ghana? Because we could have done this elsewhere. You know, Ghana has a fascination. Well, I have, beyond being one of my favorite countries, I lived here for 4 years, from 2004 to 2008. But Ghana has a certain fascination. Ghana is one of the first countries in Africa that's given a visa to every African. It's visa-free. You show up at Kotoka International Airport, you get a visa. That is the principle of Africa, because the nature of the mobility in the continent means that you need to find capacity where it is. You need to tap into the best resources, whether your skin is Ghanaian or Nigerian. There's no difference between you and I, Ghanaian and Nigerian. So we want to do this here because Ghana is the first of many things. The very first well-accepted transition from authoritarianism to democracy was here. You know, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ghana demonstrated that. Ghana has been first in many things else. You continue to have political transitions, even with the slimmest of electoral margins. We have 50,000 votes difference between life and death. In other parts of the continent, the difference is much higher, and people are killing themselves. So we want Ghana to own this. We want Ghana to champion this. We want Ghana to be the new liberator for Africa again, as he liberated the continent in 1957.
You seem to have a lot of hope in us.
I do, because I know the system, I know the people. I've interacted in my time here with both opposition and governing, and seen the switch. You know, and so we have the Speaker of Parliament, Professor Quay, accepted to be our host. And, you know, when we went to brief him, he was so excited. So he's been very active in preparation for this conference.
But have you monitored, whilst you lived in Ghana, did you ever monitor our own politics, the kind of conversations that we have? Because it looks like the kind of view that others have of us, sometimes we don't see it ourselves because we see the things that go wrong in our own country. It's
not peculiar to Ghana. I think it's a human condition. You know, in my time here, I traveled to all the regions of the country. So I know the country inside out. A lot of the work I did was supporting the deepening of democracy in Ghana and preventing conflict. So I'm not surprised when the average Ghanaian sees what is wrong more than what is good. I like to encourage them to travel around the continent. When you travel around the continent, there are parts of Africa, Nana. In this September 2017, even making internet is a problem. Parts of the continent, road network was just a slight improvement on what the British have left or the French left. There are significant structural constraints. And you come here, the openness, the freedom, the ability of the media to challenge anybody in governance, that's a best practice example.
Even
Ghanaians should have more faith. Ghanaians should have more faith in their institutions. And you know the thing about institutional transformation, it's not instant coffee. You know, the average report shows, the evidence is that to transform an institution is a generation. 33 years. But Africans want it in 3 years. It's not going to happen. So let's have the faith in our institutions and in our leadership, knowing that it's also not a linear transaction. So leadership doesn't go forward all the time. Sometimes it comes back, sometimes it goes forward. But in the life of a country, the leadership of 5 years or 10 years is a small drop compared to where the country is headed. The key is to be like the advert in the Johnny Walker whiskey. Keep walking. Because you're walking forward. That is what Ghana represents to the continent. So our hope is that the government of Ghana will champion this and work with it and demonstrate to Ghanaians the new leadership that Africa needs.
So we're hoping, whilst you have our speaker here, that one of the conversations that we've been having in the name of governance and democracy is for the RTI, the Right to Information Bill, to be passed. So we're hoping that will be one of the conversations that will come up. Is in the spirit of what you're doing.
I will not go to the intra-Ghana politics and conversation. The key is that in a democratic society, you need information across board so that people can know what is happening in governance. Because it's that perception that we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's working for us. that perhaps lead people to different forms of behavior. So we wish Ghanaians well in that conversation, and we do hope that you can find common ground on what is good for Ghana. What we do hope is that Ghana demonstrates leadership that the rest of the continent can copy from. But we are hoping that from these conversations, the next step for us is to begin to present these ideas to our governments, civil society, research centers. We need civil society to begin to say to governments, well, if this is the emergent thinking on how governance should be run in Africa, why are you waiting? Let's have an internal national conversation on the subject so that you can design what works for you. There will be no template for the 54 countries. It's about adaptability. But so what can work for Mauritania might be different from what works for Seychelles. But we do hope that the broad elements of what's good for a particular country will reflect around these general ideas that we are now espousing.
All right. So today I'm coming to you live from the Kempinski Hotel. My guest is Dr. Uzonia Ojiolo, who is a regional cluster leader for governance and peace building in Africa. Why are we here? Well, there's a big conversation happening today. It's a high-level policy dialogue. The future of governance in Africa is a new concept. That's the question. Is a new concept of governance. The key to accelerating the prosperity agenda is on today and tomorrow, 30th of September 2017. Fortunately for us on the AM show on JoyNews, we get to get a feel of what will happen later or today and then tomorrow as well. I am hoping that whilst you have these conversations, would there be time on Kenya? Would there be something said on Kenya? Because that's like the latest, really.
Of course, you should expect that, because we have a session that's going to look at issues around elections. You can't discuss governance in Africa without discussing elections. So what I find fascinating is that across the international development agenda is focusing on the rules of elections. And we should, because clarity of the rules can enable contestants know what to expect. The problem, Nana, is that the rules of elections alone are not enough to manage political transition in plural societies, in diverse societies as Africa. So we also need to understand about the rules of politics. So what is missing is that we are focused on the rules of elections rather than combining the rules of elections, the rules of politics. Because if the rules of politics is clear, you wouldn't worry if you lose. I wouldn't come after you because I defeated you in an election. So people feel that unless they've won an election, all the economic, social, and other aspirations are extinguished. So you need to have the assurance that it's a battle, it's a transition. You may rule today, we will rule tomorrow. But what is the broad contours that define our national interests? That's what you see in many other parts of the world. So our focus on elections is important. Actually, the Chief Justice of Kenya was supposed to come and be with us today, but I think he had some personal emergencies. At the last minute, he canceled. We wanted to hear from him also, his reflections on this important question.
But there will be great people to reflect on these issues. Can you take us through the different kind of sessions that you'll be having?
Excellent, thank you. We will have the former president of Liberia, Amos Sawyer, is supposed to be a keynote speaker. Last night he had a personal emergency, but he sent a representative who will frame the conversation. And then we have President Joyce Banda and a couple of other senior African leaders, former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth. We'll begin by the first session to look at, so what is it about our governing systems that's not working? And based on that conversation, we invite the rest of the participants to interrogate what are the various systems of governance, both indigenous and inherited, and what have we learned from those. The idea is to have a common script. It's like a shared understanding of what the problem is. Because if we're able to develop a shared understanding of what the problem is, then it's then easier to begin to chart the pathways. What are the various pathways to addressing the problem? And then we have discussions around issues of elections, what are the issues about human rights? And then issues about leadership. You know, the best aspirations, the best national development plans are meaningless if you don't have the quality of leadership that inspires, that coordinates, includes, brings people together, and has a vision, and says, this is where I want to take this country. Join me in that enterprise. Leaders make mistakes. So it's okay for somebody to try something and fail. The problem we see is that Africans don't think that the leaders are trying enough for them. So we want them to have the courage to try and fail and learn in the process of trying. They're not trying at all because of the fear of failure. So it's 2 days. You know, there's so many subjects to discuss. But we've highlighted these 4 critical elements as the key. Now, the important thing then is to have separate work groups.
Okay.
Take each of these subjects and burrow in more depth and come with pragmatic, clear recommendations. That unless we do that, Nana, most of Africa is still in the agricultural age. We've had the first industrial revolution. We have the second revolution. Now we're into quantum computing, what they call the 4th industrial revolution. Apart from South Africa, majority of the continent is hose, small implements. Now, in that kind of age, there's a political economy to governance. And that political economy is about patronage. It's about rent-seeking. So it defines our politics. So if you want to move on, you have to see how do you move beyond the agricultural age where we are into at least an industrial state for Africa, which has a defining element about how the society is organized. That's the difference. So we have to begin from there and to say this is the vision and what do we need to do working backwards.
So great African leaders you have converged at one point to discuss very important issues on the continent. But how, for us, the ordinary people who will not get the opportunity to witness the conversations, how can we measure your effort here today and tomorrow? How do we see it reflect on the ground in our various countries?
That is a fascinating question. One of the benefits is, of course, our excellent partnership with Joy FM, because now you're getting the most of the world, both through your direct broadcasting in Ghana, but your international broadcasting, to know that this is happening. So awareness is already an issue. They're getting more Africans aware, both through you, but also through other partners. But then the conversations that begin to happen at the national level. So how many of the participants take this back? For those in leadership, those aspiring to leadership, those in civil society, how many take this back to promote a national conversation? How many countries begin to take these ideas forward? For us as UNDP and our partners International IDEA, we are present as UNDP in 170 countries. We are present in all the 54 countries in Africa. As Director for Governance for Africa, part of my responsibility is to take these ideas and ground them into UNDP's support to African countries and support our national partners in each of these countries to have a conversation that takes it forward. It will be a national process. How far do you want to go? What do you want to implement? What we must not pretend about is that this conversation no longer needs to happen. It is urgent, Nana. It is urgent. And our responsibility is for governments and state institutions that want to take it forward. We're going to support them. And we support them to develop programs to implement. So there's a long road to travel.
Sure.
This is just the beginning.
We'll take it one step at a time.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your time this
Nana.
morning.
Real pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you for the excellent work that Joy FM is doing.
Thank you. You're still watching the AM show. Keep watching. One of my favorite all-time musicians is on the show today. I was keeping it away from you, but Kontihene is our guest on the show. Remember this time with Riverman as well. And Klebo White could just be very generous and give you a ticket to watch his latest play, The Comeback. Keep watching the show. Benis Abubeidu is going to take it over from here.
Let's go.
Sure, thank you very much, Mama V. That was a very, very insightful interview with Dr. Ozonia Ojielo. He's the Regional Cluster Director of Governance and Peace Building with the UNDP. And he's been talking to us about that high-level conversation, policy dialogue they're going to be having here in Ghana for 2 days. And this is meant to send a certain message across to all African leaders that the time, according to Dr. Ojielo, to reset the batting is now. What will the new Africa look like? We sure will take you back to the Kempinski Hotel for that high policy dialogue, talking about the future of governance in Africa.